The familiar upbeat music of The Steve Harvey Show fills the studio as cameras pan across the enthusiastic audience. Steve Harvey strides confidently onto the stage, his trademark smile masking an inner struggle known only to him. Today's guest isn't just another celebrity promoting their latest project. Jonathan Roumie, the man who portrays Jesus in the groundbreaking series The Chosen, carries something far more valuable than acting tips or Hollywood stories. He carries one sentence destined to crack open the armor of one of television's most composed hosts. What begins as a standard interview is about to become a divine appointment neither man saw coming. The cameras capture it all. The exact moment when 13 carefully chosen words cause Steve Harvey, a man famous for his command of language, to completely lose his composure on national television. "I've interviewed thousands of people on this stage," Steve later confesses, tears streaming openly down his face. "But I've never had someone look into my soul and speak directly to my deepest doubt like that." The sentence that broke through decades of Steve's carefully constructed public persona wasn't rehearsed or planned. It came as an unexpected whisper that Jonathan felt compelled to share, unaware it would address a private crisis of faith Steve had never revealed publicly. What was this powerful sentence that caused such a profound transformation? And how did Jonathan Roumie, a man who spends his days portraying Jesus, know exactly what Steve Harvey needed to hear at precisely the moment he needed to hear it? This is the remarkable story of a divine connection that transcended the typical talk show format and left everyone in the studio, including the usually unshakable host himself, moved to tears by the power of perfectly timed truth. The interview begins casually enough, with Steve welcoming Jonathan to the show with his characteristic charm. What the audience doesn't realize is that behind Steve's confident smile lies a man wrestling with profound spiritual questions. For months, Steve had been questioning his purpose, wondering if his platform was making any real difference in the world. The crucifix hanging around his neck, his mother's cherished possession, felt increasingly heavy with expectation. He wore it faithfully every day, but lately had been asking himself whether he was truly honoring her legacy or merely going through the motions. Jonathan Roumie walks onto the stage with a humble presence that seems almost contradictory to his rising fame. Playing Jesus in The Chosen has made him recognizable worldwide, but there's something noticeably grounded about him, a quiet centeredness that immediately sets this interview apart. What the cameras don't capture is the morning Jonathan spent in prayer before arriving at the studio, feeling an unusual burden to prepare not just for questions about his career, but for something more significant. "I don't know why," he had told a friend, "but I feel like today's conversation is meant to be about more than just promoting the show." As they exchange pleasantries and settle into their seats, neither man realizes they're on a collision course with divine timing. Jonathan notices the crucifix hanging from Steve's neck, a detail that triggers a memory he hasn't shared publicly before. Steve follows Jonathan's gaze, unconsciously touching the cross with his fingertips in what seems like a protective gesture. There's a brief, unspoken moment of recognition between them, two men of faith connecting on a level deeper than their public personas. What happens next will demonstrate the extraordinary power of being in the right place, at the right time, with exactly the right words. Words that would address Steve Harvey's unspoken spiritual crisis with such precision that they could only have been divinely inspired. "I've been following your journey with The Chosen," Steve begins, settling into interview mode. "And I've got to say, what you folks are doing is nothing short of revolutionary." The conversation flows naturally as Jonathan speaks about his early career struggles, the years of small parts and uncertainty that tested his commitment to acting. "There were moments I seriously wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake," Jonathan admits with a self-deprecating smile. "But something kept pulling me forward, even when logic said to quit." Steve nods knowingly, connecting with the story of perseverance against overwhelming odds. "Faith is like that sometimes," Steve offers. "It doesn't always make sense to keep going, but something inside won't let you stop. Jonathan's eyes light up at this observation, leaning forward slightly as if to emphasize his agreement. The energy in the studio shifts subtly as the conversation deepens beyond the typical celebrity interview. They discuss how The Chosen came along at a point when Jonathan was at another crossroads in his career. "It wasn't just another acting job," Jonathan explains. "It felt like everything in my life had been preparation for this role." When Steve asks what it's like to portray Jesus on screen, Jonathan pauses, gathering his thoughts with noticeable care. "It's the greatest honor and the greatest responsibility I've ever had," he answers finally. "I begin each filming day in prayer, asking for guidance, for humility, for the ability to step aside and let something greater than myself come through." Steve's expression shifts from professional interest to deeper engagement, recognizing the sincerity behind Jonathan's words. "And how has playing this role affected your own faith journey?" Steve asks, his tone more personal than before. Jonathan takes a breath, seemingly deciding how much to share in this public setting. "It's transformed me completely," he says with quiet conviction. "You can't help but be changed when you're daily engaging with Jesus' words, his actions, his heart for people." The studio grows quieter, the audience leaning in collectively. Something in Jonathan's honest vulnerability strikes a chord with Steve, who unconsciously touches the crucifix around his neck again, a gesture not lost on his guest. Jonathan glances at the cross for the second time, and something in his expression changes, as if making a decision. "You know, Steve," Jonathan says, his voice taking on a different quality altogether. "I've been wanting to tell you something since I walked out here today." Steve raises his eyebrows slightly, curious but open. "The floor is yours, brother," he responds, gesturing welcomingly, unaware that the next words he hears will pierce straight through to a spiritual struggle he's never voiced publicly. Jonathan shifts in his seat, as if preparing to share something he hadn't planned to reveal. "I noticed your crucifix right away," he begins, gesturing toward Steve's neck. "And it reminded me of something important." Steve touches the small cross again, a seemingly unconscious gesture he's repeated throughout their conversation. "This old thing?" Steve asks with a humble smile. "I've had it for years. Wear it every day." Jonathan nods, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly it," he says. "It's not just an accessory to you, it's a constant reminder of your faith." The camera captures a flicker of vulnerability passing across Steve's usually confident demeanor, as if Jonathan has somehow seen past his public persona. Jonathan takes a deep breath before continuing, his voice dropping slightly. "Steve, I believe God wants you to know that what you're doing matters more than you realize right now." The words land with visible impact, hanging in the air between them. The studio grows completely silent, the audience collectively holding their breath. Steve's expression freezes, caught off guard by the directness and timing of this statement. "Your voice reaches people who would never set foot in a church," Jonathan continues, his eyes never leaving Steve's. "And that crucifix you wear, your mother's crucifix. Her legacy continues every time you speak faith into someone's life, even when you can't see the impact." Steve's composure visibly wavers, his eyes widening in stunned recognition. "How did you know?" he asks, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know I've been questioning my purpose lately?" The cameras catch the exact moment. That split second when Steve Harvey's carefully maintained professional mask cracks completely. Jonathan smiles gently, compassion evident in his expression. "I didn't," he admits simply. "But God did." A single tear escapes down Steve's cheek as he processes these words. The sentence has hit with uncanny precision, addressing doubts he's never voiced publicly. "I've been feeling burnt out," Steve confesses, his honesty creating a sacred space in the midst of the television studio. "Wondering if any of it matters, if I'm making any difference at all." The audience remains absolutely silent, witnessing a moment of authenticity so rare in television that it feels almost intrusive to watch. "You're not just an entertainer, Steve," Jonathan says, leaning forward with quiet intensity. "You're a minister disguised as a talk show host. And sometimes, that's exactly what people need." These words, this one sentence about being a minister disguised as an entertainer, strikes with the force of revelation. Steve's hand moves to cover his mouth, emotion overwhelming him completely now. The producer signals desperately from offstage, but neither man notices. They've transcended the format of daytime television entirely, creating a moment of spiritual connection that no one in the studio will soon forget. "Can I share something with you, Jonathan?" Steve asks, after taking a moment to compose himself, though the emotion remains clearly visible. "Something I don't talk about much." Jonathan nods encouragingly, creating space for Steve to share. "That crucifix you keep mentioning?" Steve begins, touching it once more with deliberate reverence. "It belonged to my mother." His voice softens as he continues. "She wore it every day of her adult life, through raising kids alone, through working multiple jobs, through all kinds of struggles." Jonathan listens with respectful attention, recognizing the sacred nature of this personal story. "When she passed, it was the one thing I wanted, because it reminded me of her unshakable faith, even when life was hard." Steve pauses, gathering himself. "Some days it feels heavy, like I'm not living up to her example." The admission comes with such raw honesty that several audience members can be seen wiping away tears. "And lately," Steve continues, no longer concerned about maintaining his public image, "I've been wondering if anything I do on this stage really matters in the grand scheme of things. If I'm honoring her faith, or just wearing a symbol without substance." Jonathan leans forward, his expression compassionate. "Can I tell you something?" he asks softly. When Steve nods, Jonathan continues with gentle conviction. "I believe she sees you now, and I believe she's proud of how you've honored her faith." The words land with visible impact as Steve's eyes fill with tears again. He doesn't try to hide them this time. That crucifix around your neck has become exactly what it's meant to be. Not just a symbol of faith, but a connection between generations, a testament that survives even death. Steve nods slowly, visibly processing this perspective shift in real time. "Thank you for that," he says finally, his voice rough with emotion. "That means more than you know." The studio remains unusually silent, the audience collectively recognizing they're witnessing something authentic and unscripted. Some conversations go beyond talk shows and entertainment, Jonathan observes. Sometimes we're just two people sharing the journey of faith. Steve wipes discreetly at his eyes, but makes no further attempt to hide his emotional response. "You know," he says after a moment, "I've interviewed hundreds of celebrities on this stage." He gestures around the studio before continuing. "But this conversation feels different." Jonathan waits attentively as Steve searches for the right words. "It feels like purpose, not just programming," Steve concludes simply. The transformation is visible. Something has fundamentally shifted in Steve's countenance. The doubt and weariness that had been subtly present at the beginning of their conversation has been replaced by a renewed sense of clarity. His mother's crucifix, which he absent-mindedly touched throughout the interview, now rests against his chest with new significance, not as a burden of expectation, but as confirmation of a legacy he's actively continuing in his own unique way. "You know what the hardest part of playing Jesus is?" Jonathan asks, shifting the conversation slightly. Steve looks up with interest, having regained some of his composure, though the emotional current still runs strong. "It's remembering that he sees beyond our failures and shortcomings to our potential." Jonathan speaks with gentle authority as he continues. "We're so hard on ourselves, focusing on where we fall short, but that's not how he sees us at all." Steve nods slowly, absorbing this perspective. That's a word for me today, he admits. I've been too focused on my own inadequacies lately. Jonathan leans forward, his expression earnest. The disciples weren't chosen because they were perfect, he observes. They were chosen because they were willing to follow, even with all their flaws and doubts. Steve processes this visibly, considering its application to his own life. And look at the impact they had, Jonathan concludes, not because of their perfection, but because of their faithfulness. As the conversation deepens, Steve turns to address the audience, who have remained unusually engaged throughout this deeply personal exchange. Folks, I've been doing this show for a long time, he begins, emotion still evident in his voice despite his effort to maintain composure. But I don't think we've ever had a moment quite like this before. The audience murmurs in agreement. Many visibly move themselves. Sometimes you think you're just doing an interview, and God turns it into something else entirely. That's how he works, Jonathan adds with a gentle smile, using ordinary moments for extraordinary purposes. Steve nods in agreement, then looks directly at the camera. I want to speak to those of you watching who might be questioning your purpose right now, he says with newfound conviction. Maybe you're wearing your own version of this crucifix, carrying on a legacy, doing work that sometimes feels insignificant, wondering if anyone notices or cares. The studio grows completely silent as Steve continues. What I'm learning today, right here in real time, is that we don't always get to see the impact we're having. Jonathan reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out a small box. I brought something for you, he says. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you on air, but after our conversation, it feels right. Steve looks surprised by the unexpected gesture. Open it, Jonathan encourages gently. Steve carefully opens the small box, revealing a simple wooden cross pendant on a leather cord. It's from Jerusalem, Jonathan explains, as Steve lifts it from the box with evident reverence. I got it while we were filming Season 3 in the Holy Land. The olive wood comes from trees in Gethsemane, where Jesus prayed before his crucifixion. Steve examines it closely, clearly moved by the significance of the gift. I wanted you to have something tangible, Jonathan explains warmly, to remind you that your faith journey matters, that even when you don't see the impact, God is working through you in ways you might never know this side of heaven. Steve looks from the pendant to Jonathan with profound gratitude. I'll treasure this, he promises. And every time I see it, I'll remember this conversation and that sometimes the most important ministry happens outside church walls, even on a talk show stage. As they prepare to conclude, Steve turns once more to Jonathan. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to share with our audience? It's an invitation that clearly opens the door for Jonathan to leave viewers with a final thought. Just that whatever you're going through right now, whatever struggle or waiting period you're in, it's not wasted, Jonathan says, looking directly at the camera. God is working even when you can't see it, preparing you for what's ahead. The audience responds with spontaneous applause, many rising to their feet in appreciation of Jonathan's authenticity and encouragement. Steve stands as well, visibly transformed from the man who walked onto the stage earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Roumie, he announces, his voice carrying both emotion and deep respect. The applause grows louder as Jonathan stands and embraces Steve warmly. Not the brief performative hug of television, but a genuine connection between two men who have shared something meaningful. We'll be right back after this break, Steve says to the camera, his voice rougher than usual, but filled with authentic gratitude. The cameras begin to cut away, but not before capturing one final moment. Steve looking down at the small box containing the wooden cross, then back at Jonathan with profound appreciation. When the cameras return, Steve addresses the audience with refreshing candor. If you're just joining us, you missed something pretty special, he admits. Sometimes television is just entertainment, but sometimes, if we're fortunate, it becomes a vehicle for something more important. He gestures toward Jonathan, who sits beside him with characteristic humility. "Thank you for your transparency, your encouragement, and your faith," Steve says sincerely. "You came to talk about the chosen, but you ended up reminding all of us about what truly matters." "That's very kind," Jonathan responds with genuine appreciation. "But I believe that's exactly what the chosen is ultimately about, reminding people of what truly matters." Have you ever experienced a moment when a single sentence changed your entire perspective? Have you received a word of encouragement that came at exactly the right time, as if divinely orchestrated? Jonathan Roumie's conversation with Steve Harvey reminds us that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen through the simplest words, spoken with authenticity and received with an open heart. This extraordinary exchange between two men of faith demonstrates how God can use anyone, talk show hosts, actors, or perhaps even you, to speak life-changing truth into someone else's journey. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe in the power of divinely timed words to transform lives when we least expect it. And tell us in the comments, what's the one sentence that changed your perspective on faith?